Somewhere around 4,000 years ago, one of the largest and most organized societies of the ancient world simply stopped building cities. There is no burning layer spread across its towns. There is no monument anywhere celebrating a king who conquered it. No neighboring empire left a record of defeating it. The people did not vanish from the land, and yet within a few centuries the streets, the drains, the warehouses, and the workshops that had defined them were gone. This is the puzzle of the Indus Valley Civilization, and it remains one of the strangest endings in human history, because it looks far less like a fall and far more like a slow, quiet exit. To understand why that ending is so strange, you first have to understand how big this thing actually was. At its height, roughly between 2,600 and 1,900 before the Common Era, the Indus civilization covered a territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia put together, stretching across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, and touching parts of Afghanistan. Archaeologists have recorded more than 1,000 settlements connected to it. The best known are Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, but there are many others, including Dholavira in Gujarat with its enormous reservoirs cut into stone, Rakhigarhi in Haryana, Lothal near the old coastline, Kalibangan on the bed of a river that no longer flows, and Ganweriwala in the Cholistan desert. Mohenjo-daro and Dholavira are both inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List today, which gives you some sense of how much of that world is still standing. What makes these cities remarkable is not really their size, it is their sameness. Walk into a mature Harappan city and you find streets laid out on a rough grid, houses built around courtyards, wells sunk in neighborhood after neighborhood, and covered drains running along the lanes carrying wastewater out of the residential areas. The bricks were made to consistent proportions across enormous distances. The weights, small cubes usually cut from chert, follow a standardized system, which means a merchant in one city and a merchant hundreds of kilometers away were measuring the same way. Thousands of small stone seals carry a script and animal motifs that repeat across the whole region. Whatever held this civilization together, it produced a level of shared practice that is genuinely difficult to explain because it did not seem to need the tools that other ancient states used to enforce order. And that is where the story starts to feel unusual. Compared with Mesopotamia and Egypt in the same centuries, the Indus sites have not produced the same visual culture of warfare. Archaeologists have not confidently identified royal tombs filled with treasure, or palaces that clearly belong to a single ruling family, or monumental carvings of a leader standing over defeated enemies. There are copper and bronze tools and blades, and some of them could certainly be used as weapons. But the great arsenals, the mass graves of soldiers, the sieges, and the triumphal art that dominate the record elsewhere are not there in the same way. Some sites do have walls and gateways, and there is real debate about what those walls were for, because a wall can hold back a flood, mark a boundary, or control the movement of goods just as easily as it can stop an army. Even the famous large structures at Mohenjo-daro, including the building often described as a granary, have identifications that scholars continue to argue about. The honest summary is that the evidence for organized large-scale war in this civilization is thin, and thin evidence is not the same thing as proof that war never happened. For much of the 20th century, though, there was a very confident answer to the question of what ended it. In 1947, the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler proposed that invaders had destroyed the cities. He pointed to groups of skeletons found at Mohenjo-daro and connected them to passages in the Rig Veda that described the god Indra as a breaker of forts. It was a vivid story, and it spread quickly into textbooks. The problem is that it did not survive closer inspection. In 1964, the archaeologist George Dales published an essay titled The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-daro, in which he pointed out that those skeletons did not come from a single moment of slaughter at all. They were found in different parts of the site, at different levels, in different states, some in areas that had already been abandoned, and there was no destruction layer that tied them together into one battle. Since then, the idea of a violent invasion bringing down the cities has lost most of its support among specialists. Recent genetics has added another layer to that discussion, though it needs to be described carefully. In 2019, a team published a genome recovered from a burial at Rakhigarhi, and separately, a large study in the journal Science examined ancestry patterns across South and Central Asia using many ancient individuals. Together, these studies indicate that ancestry associated with steppe pastoralist populations becomes visible in South Asia during the second millennium before the Common Era, which is after the mature Harappan cities had already begun to decline. Population movement into the subcontinent is a real and well-studied phenomenon. What the current evidence does not support is the idea that a conquering army arrived and knocked these cities over. The timing does not line up, and this remains an active area of research rather than a closed question. So what does the archaeology actually show happening? Around 1900 before the Common Era, the mature phase gives way to what archaeologists call the late Harappan period, and the change is visible everywhere, but it is gradual. Large cities shrink. Population appears to shift eastward and southward toward the plains between the Ganges and the Yamuna, and into Gujarat. The script stops appearing on seals. The standardized weights become less common. The long-distance trade goods, the carnelian beads, and the shell bangles that moved across the region become rarer. New pottery traditions appear, including the assemblage associated with what is called the cemetery H culture in Punjab. Nobody switches off. The system that coordinated hundreds of settlements simply stops being maintained, one function at a time. The strongest explanation researchers have assembled for why that happened involves water, and it comes from outside archaeology. In 2014, a study published in the journal Geology examined sediments from Kotla Dahar, a lake in Haryana, and reported isotopic evidence for an abrupt weakening of the summer monsoon in northwest India around 4,100 years ago. That signal sits inside a wider window of climate disruption that specialists call the 4.2 kilo-year event, which shows up in records from several parts of the world in roughly the same period. A weaker and less reliable monsoon in this particular landscape is not a small inconvenience. It changes how much water arrives, when it arrives, and whether you can count on it arriving at all. Alongside that, geologists have been rewriting our understanding of the rivers themselves. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012 mapped the fluvial landscapes of the Harappan world and argued that many settlements sat along a river system that was already changing character. Other work, including dating studies of river sediments and a 2017 paper in Nature Communications, suggests that the Ghaggar-Hakra channel, the dry riverbed along which a very large number of Harappan sites are found, had lost its major glacier-fed Himalayan input long before the cities were built and was by then dependent mainly on monsoon rainfall. If that reconstruction holds, then an enormous stretch of Harappan settlement was farming on a river that lived or died by the rains. Weaken the monsoon, and you do not just get a drought. You get a river corridor that becomes unpredictable, sometimes flooding, sometimes barely flowing, in a place where thousands of people had organized their entire agricultural year around it. What is important here is that this was not a simple story of everyone starving. Researchers working on long-term projects in northwest India have argued that Harappan farmers were considerably more adaptable than the collapse narrative suggests. There is evidence for diversified cropping, for use of both winter and summer growing seasons, and for a shift toward hardier crops such as millets and toward rice in some regions. Farming continued, villages continued. What appears to have failed is something more specific and more fragile, which is the surplus. A city with planned drainage, standardized bricks, professional craftspeople, and long-distance trade depends on a reliable agricultural surplus arriving from somewhere else, year after year. Diversified rain-fed farming keeps families alive, but it produces a smaller, more local, more variable surplus, and that is exactly the kind of economy that cannot support large concentrated urban populations or the institutions that maintain standards across 1,000 settlements. Trade seems to have moved in the same direction. Mesopotamian texts refer to a distant land called Meluha, which many scholars identify with the Indus region, and Indus-style seals and long carnelian beads have been found in Mesopotamian contexts. Those references and those objects become scarcer in the early second millennium before the Common Era. Mesopotamia itself was going through serious political disruption during that same window. If you were a Harappan port town whose entire reason for existing was moving beads and timber and cotton toward the west, the closing of that market removes the purpose of your warehouses long before it removes your food. There is one more thread, and it deserves careful handling because the sample sizes are small. A study published in 2013 in PLOS 1 examined skeletal remains from Harappa and reported evidence of increased infectious disease, including indicators consistent with leprosy and tuberculosis, along with increased signs of cranial injury in the later phase of the site. The authors also noted that this burden did not appear to be shared evenly across the population. Human remains from these sites are limited, so this is one line of evidence rather than a verdict. But it is at least consistent with a picture of communities under growing stress, with movement, crowding, and inequality rising as the older order came apart. Put all of it together, and the answer to the question in the title starts to look like this. The Indus Valley Civilization did not vanish, and it very probably did not need a war to end. What ended was a way of organizing life. The rains became less dependable, a major river system became unreliable, the export markets closed, the surplus that fed the cities shrank, and the shared standards that had held 1,000 settlements in alignment stopped being worth maintaining. People responded the way people usually do, which is to move toward better water, farm differently, and get on with it. Roughly 1,000 years later, urban life on a large scale returned to the subcontinent, this time in the Ganges Plain, built by societies that inherited a great deal from what came before, even though the connection is still being worked out. And here's the part that keeps this civilization out of reach. The reason we are forced to argue from drains and sediments and riverbeds is that we cannot read a single word these people wrote. Their script survives on thousands of seals and small objects, with something in the range of 400 to 600 distinct signs, but the inscriptions are extremely short, often only around 5 signs long. There is no bilingual inscription like the Rosetta Stone to unlock it. Decades of attempts have produced competing proposals and no accepted decipherment, and a minority of researchers even question whether it encodes spoken language in the usual sense. So we have their cities, their bricks, their weights, and their bones, and not their voice. Whatever they thought was happening to them, they may well have recorded it, and we are standing in front of it, unable to read it. That is what makes this story stay with you. We are used to civilizations ending loudly, with sacked capitals and burned palaces and a conqueror who writes the final chapter. The Indus reminds us that a society can be undone by something far quieter. Rivers that move, rain that arrives late, buyers who stop buying, a system beautifully engineered for one set of conditions and slightly too rigid for the next. It did not lose a war. It lost the conditions that made its way of living possible, and the people who built it did the sensible thing and walked away from the cities they no longer needed. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and tell me in the comments which lost civilization you want next.